Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Lodewijk Muns. Episode 13. Bach on the piano. The Chromatic Fantasia and Fugue in D minor. The odd beginning of Bach's Chromatic Fantasia and Fugue in D minor. Scales up and down, brusque and brisk. Many pianists emphasize that brusqueness and briskness. Alternatively, one may bring out the harmonic implications, the chords and arpeggios hidden in the scales. Every scale is an arpeggio with passing notes. Scales and arpeggios are typical practice material for keyboard players. As such, they are ready to hand for improvisation. Insubstantial but effective, almost as if the hands were thinking for themselves. In Bach's Fantasia, it seems as if the hands themselves are controlling the musical ideas, insofar as you can speak of ideas in this up and down. These self-controlling, self-thinking hands keep alternating close together in passages that could also be played by one hand. Until they linger around the middle of the keyboard. Still restless, the fingers play chords up and down, as if waiting for a clear instruction. This is the way to go. In the manuscript sources, Bach's own handwriting is lost, we here find an abbreviated notation. There can be little misunderstanding about the interpretation. One arpeggio up and down is written out in full. The next ones are notated as simple block chords. But the word arpeggio, hopping, tells the player to go on breaking them up and down. This is a feature of Baroque harpsichord style that can be easily and effectively adapted to the piano. Profiting from the pedal, the right damper lifting pedal, one may increase sonority, double the bass in octaves, apply dynamics, forte, piano, and emphasize a certain voice, usually the top, sometimes the middle or the bass. In the time when the harpsichord disappeared from the scene and the piano, fortepiano, pianoforte, assumed its position as the most widely used keyboard instrument, the chromatic was not forgotten. One of the most memorable performances of the work must have been that by Felix Mendelssohn. He played the chromatic with great success in a concert in February 1840. The audience asked in a frenzy for a repeat, he writes in a letter to his mother, ganz rasend und stürmisch. The arpeggio passages were the main effect. To his sister Fanny he writes, I allow myself all kinds of crescendos and pianos and fortissimos, of course with pedal and doubling of the bass notes. In this way the harmonic sequences sound splendidly on the stout modern grands. Auf den dicken neuen Flügeln. He takes the trouble of writing out a few arpeggios in full. Notable is his practice of initially arpeggiating each chord twice. He may have based that practice on a suggestion in the preface from Friedrich Griepenkuyl's edition from 1819. Griepenkuйл, in turn, based it on Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's essay on the true art of playing keyboard instruments, a standard work for earlier generations of harpsichordists, clavichordists and pianists. Emanuel Bach writes in the final chapter on the free fantasia or improvisation that one should not always arpeggiate in one color. This is perhaps the most important rule. On the piano, that would include dynamic coloring. Mendelssohn's contemporary Franz Liszt also played the chromatic in his concerts. According to one critic, the music theorist Adolf Bernhard Marx, he rushed through the Fantasia and Fugue as if in a bacchantic frenzy, the Fugue twice as fast as one is used to and able to hear it. This A.B. Marx was annoyed by the arpeggios as they were usually played. For him, the seriousness and coherence of the work demanded that the chords be played as short, broken block chords, rock masses in the whimsical passage work. Marx was promptly rebutted by Griepenkerl, who maintained that continuous arpeggiation is the historically correct performance. A curious detail is that Griepenkerl wants to make the duration of each chord dependent on the varying number of notes. This disrupts the beat, but, in his opinion, creates a higher kind of rhythm. It should then sound like this. Most players adopt the more obvious solution of keeping the beat, more or less, playing faster and slower groups of notes, and depending on the number of voices in the chord. The freedom you can take with this suggests spontaneous improvisation. The hands find their way, with a few strange and surprising chromatic detours, to a temporary resolution on the dominant chord. But the top note lingers thinly in the air. From this emerges a true voice, a voice that seems hesitantly to try to say something without words. The voice seems to seek confirmation and then hesitates again, protests impatiently, and goes through a whole spectrum of emotional attitudes before finally sinking into deep melancholy. It is striking how seamlessly this recitative, this wordless speech singing, blends with the unsingable passage work of the keyboard idiom. In this, and in its imitation of operatic manners, the recitative could almost be called humorous. Perhaps melancholy and humor are not mutually exclusive. Although the harpsichord player can achieve much with timing, for the pianist there are regions to explore that go much further, beyond what the composer himself may have had in mind as performance possibilities. A composition can have a potential that transcends not only the written score, but also the conventions and possibilities of the performance practice of a particular moment. Anyone who plays Bach on the piano thus deviates from historical performance practice anyway. The question is, what to do with that? In this respect, the case of the Chromatic is extremely interesting because so many editions and performances of the work are available. For the time when performances were not yet recorded electronically or on cylinder or piano roll, annotated, instructive editions are our main source of information. The concept of the urtext, a score that comes as close as possible to the composer's own notation, dates back to the early 19th century, yet it was common practice until well into the 20th century that keyboard music by dead composers was provided with additional marks for fingering, tempo, dynamics, and articulation. This was mainly intended as an aid for amateurs, but at the same time models were created for what was supposed to be a correct performance. Mendelssohn refused to collaborate in such an edition. He was an early proponent of the urtext. Griepenkahl's edition from 1819 states prominently on the title page, "New edition with directions for its true interpretation, as transmitted from J.S. Bach to Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, and from him to Farkel and his students." How close the relations were between the early Bach specialist Johann Nicolaas Farkel and Bach's eldest son Friedemann is uncertain, and generally we should be somewhat suspicious of such traditions. The edition contains very detailed directions for dynamics and tempo in the recitative, which may not come from Bach himself, but are quite sensible if one imagines this recitative sung with the expressive gestures of Baroque opera. Liszt was generally reluctant to add interpretative detail in his Bach editions and arrangements. The edition under his name of the Fantasia contains only his fingering. The other directions are almost entirely taken from Griepenkahl. Surprisingly, the arpeggiations are not written out. In Liszt's case, there does not seem to have been a typical Lisztian interpretation anyway. According to a well-known anecdote, he once played in a private setting Bach's Prelude and Fugue in A minor for organ, BWV 543, 3 times in a row. First he played it sec, note perfect, then with a little more color and expression, adapted to the specifically pianistic possibilities. And finally as he would play it for the general public, like a charlatan to amaze them. That is probably how he played the Chromatic in the concert criticized by Marx. Hans von Bülow, pianist and conductor and a student of Liszt, published his edition around 1865. Bülow elevates the art of annotation to a new level, and his interpretation reflects the increased volume of the instruments of the time and the corresponding athletic ability of the pianists. His editions go well beyond the needs of amateurs. It is, we may assume, a reflection of his own playing. He doubles passages in octaves and sixths, even in the recitative, thus heightening the work's pathos. I will try, against my own intuitions, to let you hear something of Bülow's interpretation. That was my rendering of the recitative according to Bülow's instructions. The embellishments of the final bars can be found in many editions and go back to an alternative printed in Griepenkahl's edition. In my opinion, these deprive it of much of its dramatic expression, which lies precisely in the great leaps. Bülow's surprising ending in minor, if the volume is high enough, you can hear how the chord is gradually thinned downwards. That ending in minor, leaving the bass note, should allow a seamless continuation with the fugue. That was the beginning of the fugue, according to Bülow's edition. The extraordinary status of the chromatic repertoire is evidenced by the fact that between 1900 and 1912, Universal Edition in Vienna produced no less than 4 different editions, by Julius Röntgen, Albert Schweitzer, Ferruccio Busoni, and by the music theorist Heinrich Schenker, who also added 30 pages of commentary. Schenker saw himself as the only true apostle of the classical masters, and he rails with characteristic vehemence against musicians who add their own interpretation to the urtext, such as Bülow in particular. What could therefore have induced them, when called upon to edit a work by J.S. Bach, suddenly to forget their humility, negate their trust in Bach's superior artistry, and allow themselves to make so many offensive emendations, more often than not, in those very passages where Bach's genius is most evident? When this kind of musician uses the modest dimension of his own instincts as a yardstick for the immeasurable instincts of a master, he immediately reveals either his own severe ignorance or his unforgivable arrogance. Thus Schenker. Talk about arrogance. In a letter to the publisher Universal, he writes of his own edition, "I say it openly, full of joy and self-consciousness. This is the first real monument to Bach. Teachers, musicians, composers, and so on will finally gain insight into this genius." As an urtext, however, Schenker's edition falls sorely short. It simply reproduces the score of the complete edition of the Bach-Gesellschaft, including a very blunt alternation of forte and piano in the recitative, which dates back to an early 19th century manuscript. Schenker's edition, as far as I know, had little impact on musical practice. Busoni, on the other hand, has exerted great influence through his teaching, recordings, and Bach arrangements, including even a rather bizarre arrangement of the chromatic for cello and piano. His edition for solo piano was marketed as an interpretation, and his annotations are more detailed than even Bülow's. Busoni writes out the arpeggios on 2 additional staves, each preceded by a block chord with the annotation "soft, muted like an organ, somewhat stately." With Busoni we have entered the era of sound recording, but he does not seem to have recorded this particular work. His arpeggio effect can be heard in later recordings, such as Edwin Fischer's of 1931 and György Sándor's majestic interpretation of 1950, with the addition of a lower octave. This is Sándor. Majestic is the word you could use to characterize one of the three styles that can be distinguished in 20th century recordings. The other two I would call Secco and expressive. Secco, maestoso and espressivo. The division does not quite coincide with the three styles Liszt demonstrated. The dry Secco style is an early 20th century anti-romantic neo-baroque invention. Glenn Gould, the most famous exponent of the dry style, had an intense antipathy to the chromatic Fantasia. "That's Bach for people who don't like Bach," he said, and he thought the fugue was too flimsy to be authentic. Alexis Weissenberg's 1972 recording can serve as an example of this style. The majestic or grandiose style is based on a romantic 19th century image of Bach, one of Teutonic seriousness and masterful complexity. Whereas dry performances make the piano sound as if it were a kind of upgraded, super heavy harpsichord, the majestic style adopts the organ as its sound model. The actual sound of the 18th century harpsichord may have been virtually unknown to 19th century musicians. According to Bülow, it is more in the spirit of Bach to imitate or suggest the sound of the organ, rather than, as he says, paralyze the imagination by thoughts of the harpsichord. He calls it spinet. A.B. Marx contributed with his essay on the chromatic to this image of Bach the majestic. However, this very work does present a problem for this view, and Marx saw it as his task to solve this problem. That problem is the contrast between the Fantasia and the Fugue. The Fantasia is a rhapsodic, loosely structured work, which seems to lack a strong connection with the Fugue, which in turn is rather playful and not particularly sophisticated in its counterpoint. But Bach, like any genius composer, is too serious to have produced anything superficial or not quite coherent. That is Marx's assumption, and it was a prevailing view, a dogma almost, in 20th century musicology. So, if the work doesn't seem consistent, that's our mistake. We haven't looked or listened to it properly. Therefore, Marx seeks an underlying idea or mood that gives unity to the work. He finds this in a narrative or dramatic structure, a development from searching and wandering through a crisis, the recitative, to increasing affirmation, the fugue, per aspera ad astra, through woe up to the stars. It is a narrative scheme that, through its endless application, has become tiresomely banal. In the same vein, Bülow tried, I quote, to clarify the inner psychological unity of the Fantasia and Fugue by presenting them as a two-part monologue of a single person. The traditional contrast between the two gave the impression that a dreaming poet was replaced by a pedantic schoolmaster. One of the ways Bülow has done this is by starting the fugue pianissimo and building up a long climax. This is an obvious seductive idea, and it has been done by many pianists. In Busoni's edition, a later 1915 version, the fugue comes with a footnote in 4 languages. The Fantasia, says Busoni, is far superior to the Fugue. He too wants, I quote, to preserve at least the appearance of a certain spiritual connection between the two. Therefore the Fugue should not be played in a brilliant manner. In practice, that means legato articulation and numerous doublings. The result would be called bombastic nowadays. What can generally be said about interpreting Bach on the piano, that a pianist should exploit the possibilities of the instrument and thus will be able to bring out aspects of the work that are latent in a more historical or authentic one. And this was understood in the tradition of Bülow and Busoni in terms of progress. Bach was far ahead of his time. He thought, says Busoni, in such grand dimensions that the means of expression of his time were inadequate. The modernization of his works, as undertaken by Liszt and Bülow, is therefore not alien to Bach's style, but its consummation. Thus Busoni. And an essential element of that style is what he calls the monumental. I quote, "Even if the monumental is not always expressed in Bach's keyboard works, we are morally obliged to emphasize it as much as possible, in keeping with the master's spirit." I described two styles of interpretation, Secco and maestoso, and maestoso could also be called monumental. The third is espressivo. This is close to Liszt's colorful, expressive style. An expressive style, according to Griepenkerl, is the true Bachian way of playing, as it had been handed down through Bach's sons and Johann Nicolaus Forkel. Bach and sons played all the fugal voices with such an abundance of expression that each voice became a complete, true and powerful image of a state of mind. These are Griepenkerl's words, and taken literally, they are certainly exaggerated. Moreover, the authenticity of a tradition over several generations is a dubious matter. Musical taste changed radically around 1750. We can express Griepenkerl's assertion in more modest terms, that a player should give each voice its proper dynamic form. This could be a timeless precept. What is the right dynamic form? There will always be debate about that. It is this style, and this will come as no surprise, for which I have the most sympathy. Among the more interesting recordings in this style, I will mention that of Edwin Fischer, who also released a rather sparsely annotated edition in 1928. In his edition, he warns the player to avoid extreme pianissimo and fortissimo. But in his 1931 recording, after the dry and extremely fast passage work, he dives right into those extremes, and to great effect. This was episode 13 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths.